All right, hello Plastic Pills listeners. Today Matt and I are talking to Jack Black, a senior lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University. Jack Black's research focuses on media and cultural studies, drawing on philosophy and psychoanalysis. His published works have covered diverse topics like English nationalism, sports, ecology, and COVID-19. Today we are talking to Jack purely because I discovered a tweet that referred to his recently published book, Race, Racism, Political Correctness in Comedy, a Psychoanalytic Exploration, combining two of our favorite topics at the Pill Pod, comedy and psychoanalysis, and bringing it to bear on a spicy topic like comedy and racism. I couldn't really resist, so I'm excited to have you here. Jack Black, welcome to the show.
Hello, yes, thank you for that, and thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you. So before we get into like the kind of nuts and bolts of your book, in particular like the kind of theoretical underpinnings, I was just wondering what provoked you to take an interest in this topic in particular. And everyone has a kind of vision of what political correctness means, but could you maybe define political correctness and why you think it's worthy of this kind of theoretical interpretation?
Yeah, well, first off, and I always find this odd because there's a couple of times where I've spoken about the book, and I do, rather than speaking about my book, I go straight to talking about Zupančič's great book on comedy, The Odd One In, and it was purely from reading that book in particular that I then started to get sort of these ideas around comedy and how comedy could be used in a subversive way to perhaps in a sort of, to challenge dominant ideologies or, for example, to challenge something such as political correctness. And I think one of the things I think that was interesting about political correctness, I'd done research before on sort of race and racism and multiculturalism. And there seemed to be a particular period I'm thinking about I think it was around 2017 where you had certain comedians like Louis C.K., who for rightly or wrongly, I would have probably called a subversive comedian before, obviously, his sexual harassment sort of scandal came out. And then there was other instances. I start the book talking about an incident about Konstantin Kissin, who's within the UK, who was meant to do a comic gig in University of London's school at SOAS, but ended up having to sign some sort of behavioural agreement that said, you can't say anything that's, transphobic, homophobic, racist or anything like that. And he sort of made quite a fuss about that, it appearing on television in the press, that he refused to do the gig because he had to sign this sort of behavioural agreement. So there seemed to be this sort of link between me sort of reading the book and then me sort of having these comic examples that were sort of going around at the time. And I suppose one of the things which drew me into political correctness was there was never really a definition specifically of what political correctness was. There seemed to be this history that it emerged. It emerged predominantly from the left. I remember as an undergrad reading Stuart Hall had written sort of early essays and chapters as well on political correctness. And it was often seen as a sort of, it had this sort of ironic flavor to it, that if you weren't following the party line, you were being, or if you followed the party line too much, you were being politically correct. So it always had this link, in my opinion, to subversion. And the fact that it wasn't very well defined, the fact that for me, what made political correctness quite interesting was that it could be used for opposing ends. I think really it could be used as something that the right wanted to use, but also something that the left wanted to use, which is why I started to focus on it. And I started to think more critically about how it had this sort of ideological function, I suppose. And naturally, I was sort of drawn and had been using Žižek's work to explore that sort of ideological link there.
Absolutely. So, Žižek obviously writes voluminously on the topic of political correctness and why the left should steer clear of it. But before we get into that, I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about why the political right in particular has transformed this into such a subject of almost manic discourse? And you refer to a couple of the figures over the course of your book, people like Jordan Peterson, right, who kind of came to the forefront of political culture right there wrongly by attacking PC, by talking about how social justice was a big danger. Why is it that the political right is so fixated on these things?
Yeah, I think it's because they take it takes the ball completely out of the left's hands. I think what they're very good, the political right, is if you make it about culture, if you make it about identity, then you're always locked in this battle between the particulars, between the various multitude of ways that your identity can be split up into, being a white heterosexual man versus a disabled black woman. You know what I mean? And I think what the right's really good at is when it makes that the terrain of the debate, then the left's never got to win, because I think you get into this sort of fight where you're having to protect and make the argument for your political identity, you're having to fight your corner, so to speak, rather than looking towards perhaps more universal arguments that could be made, or sort of or plans there. So I think it favors the right. I mean, Jordan Peterson is such an odd example in all those contexts, because it seemed, I don't know what happened there, because Jordan Peterson wasn't an academic on political correctness or any sort of cultural issues. I mean, I don't know his academic background that well. I think I've spoken to one person actually who studied at the university he teaches at and attended one of his lectures. It was essentially all about myth, wasn't it? If I'm quite right, his original, the power of myth and the way in which myths and sort of fantasies work within culture. And it seems to be that one YouTube video where he's arguing with the student about is it a toilet or the cisgender, and off the back of that, he then became this figurehead for this sort of call it alt-right or this sort of dissonant against any form of cancel culture or political correctness. And I suppose, he's capitalized on that quite well, I suppose, in recent.
Yeah, well, Matt actually wrote a book for Zero Books on it, and I don't know if you spent a lot of time reading his academic work, Matt?
More time than anyone should spend. So I don't want to make this about Peterson, but he kind of has this argument. You can call it like a Jungian argument. I think that's also doing a bit of a discredit to Jung. But basically the idea is that, society is defined by this balance between order and chaos, right? Archetypal order and archetypal chaos. And the best kind of society is one that achieves a kind of harmony between the two. And he feels that we've been shifting too far towards chaos, which he associates for very ambiguous reasons with the political left, right? The striving for equality, emancipation from tradition, and political correctness is symptomatic of that, along with a variety of other cultural ills, right? So that's putting it in the Coles notes, right? It's actually a shame, I think, because one of the things that I was interested in seeing with his debate with Slavoj Žižek was going to be this kind of right psychoanalytic versus left psychoanalytic take. I was really hoping for that, right? Since a lot of people I know are still very attracted to Jung, but that never really emerged. Instead, they just kind of talk past each other about bad readings of the Communist Manifesto, and nothing really substantial came from it. That to me, that was just, there was no preparation there from Jordan Peterson, I think, on his behalf. I think I would definitely sort of, naturally, I would have, after using his work, but I think what Žižek did there was he tried to set the terms of the debate, which I think is the only thing you could do. It's hard to argue Jordan Peterson because he's such a brilliant, he's very good presenting, isn't he? I think
he's like an orator.
Yeah, it's like, definitely. I've had first year students who are like, we sort of come up and we'll give you this idea of this video that they've watched of Jordan Peterson online. You're like, oh Christ almighty. And you have to like chip away at that a bit. But it's because he presents it in such a way, that sort of matter of fact, common sense sort of way, where you think, well, perhaps there's something in it. And I think what Žižek was very good. He made it. I think he called him out on a couple of occasions, didn't he? Because, Jordan Peterson was just reciting the most rehashed general criticisms, wasn't he, of Marxism and the Communist Manifesto. And I think there were points where he said, well, where, who are these people then? Who are?
Yeah. That was definitely a good moment.
Yeah, I think that was the key bit of that debate. Yeah. The whole thing was odd though, that debate, I always find, didn't you? It was such a weird moment. I couldn't believe that we had the debate. Especially in the UK, we get nothing like that in the UK, like two academics. There's the constantly rehashed video, isn't there, of Chomsky and Foucault debating in French. And I just think to myself, what reality was this world where academics could debate on television? But I know that, Well,
it was super popular in Toronto. People pointed out that it was more expensive and more difficult to get tickets to that debate than it was to get Maple Leaf tickets, which is quite something if you know the Toronto Maple Leafs, because even though they're a shitty team, they are popular.
Yeah, it was by the end. I actually was there, but I got tickets pretty early with my friend, and they were like, I don't know, I think they were like $35. So still like kind of expensive to watch academics debate. But by the end, I remember one of my professor friends, I was like, oh, you should come. He tried to get tickets, and by that point, they were up to like $300, $400. It was crazy.
That's mad. What was it like there in the debate? I know.
It was. I was up in the nosebleed section. It's like kind of a big like theater, and I remember feeling it was interesting being in line, like speculating about like, okay, who's the Peterson bro, who are the Žižek bros here, and I was trying to figure it out, and like sometimes it was hard to tell, and like it was interesting to be around. In certain moments, some people would cheer, and then you could tell like they were more for Peterson, and then I was like, at one point, I think someone yelled, during Peterson's like little, I think, undergrad level presentation on the Communist Manifesto, like, it's a fucking pamphlet, bro. Like, why are you taking it so seriously? And I think he got kicked out. Actually, I think he got like escorted out of by security. But yeah, it was interesting.
Well, this actually is kind of a good segue to the next question that I wanted to ask you, and then I know Victor has something that is really pressing. But one of the things that I think Peterson and people like Charlie Kirk, for example, have really been able to capitalize on is the sense of being contrarian or counterculture, which is ironic when you think that they're pretty stodgy conservative people, right? You know, traditional values, traditional gender roles and stuff. And the reason they're able to present this way is in part because they're able to claim that the problem with PC is that it's neutered, safe, kind of authoritarian, not directly authoritarian in the sense that the state is kind of operating to suppress speech, but social pressure is kind of being applied to suppress speech. And that's really kind of ironic, I think, because, of course, we would usually associate this kind of contrarian countercultural attitude with the political left. And yet political correctness is so associated with progressive activism. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about this really strange tension and why it is that you think the political right has been able to present itself as a kind of countercultural movement in response to these kind of developments.
Yeah, that's good. That's a really interesting question. I think it's the fact that I would always come back to it. It's very similar to what I was suggesting before. I think you'll always win the particular argument. So if you need to start vouching for a particular side, then you're going to win that because people enjoy their identity, so to speak, don't they? They enjoy, where they're from or what they represent. And I think one of the things that, someone like Peterson's very good at, I mean, to me, to boil it down, it's self-help, essentially. That's essentially what I think Jordan Peterson is. So I think he gives, during a period of the decline of symbolic efficiency, the symbolic order, the big other, God doesn't exist. I think someone like Jordan Peterson, if you're associating with him as being on the right, so to speak, I mean, it'd be interesting. I don't know if he would even admit to being on. I think that might.
He's recently basically become overt about the fact that he embraces a kind of conservatism in his latest book, the Beyond Order one. He said, to the extent I'm a conservative, it's because I support, slow incremental change, kind of a mild reverence for tradition, kind of ordered liberty. If you think about like the Anglo-American tradition. Okay.
So, I mean, so that's interesting. So I think the fact what he sort of is able to support there is this focus on the particular, this focus on the order, taking that, as you said there, that sort of conservative line. But I think as well, I think this isn't it the most recent book, and I think that focus there on particularity is drawn out. I haven't read the most recent book. I've just read reviews and whatnot of it. I mean, I think it's a turn to phenomenology, isn't it? And I say that in quotes. I think he's gone and. I'm not surprised by that. I'm not surprised he's ended up with phenomenology when he makes this argument for the particular.
Well, I'm also thinking of Paul Joseph Watson, right? Back in, I think it was 2016, around the time when the Trumpists were really gaining traction. He had a shirt made that said, "Conservatism is the new counterculture," right? Which is ridiculous. And, I also was personally offended by the fact that he would invoke people like Kurt Cobain by saying, there's no great bands like Nirvana anymore. And I'm like, fucking Kurt Cobain was the biggest feminist, hugely supportive of LGBTQ rights, you name it, right? I mean, he's fucking rolling around in his grave right now. But, it did have a certain kind of traction with an audience, right? That felt that they were being marginalized by PC culture and that to resist it had this kind of punk quality to it. And I personally thought this was ridiculous, but...
Well, and also, isn't it like to fit it with the comedy theme too? I feel like, isn't it the case that also I think conservatives sometimes will like point to the comedy case of like PC trying to like shut down certain kinds as like, look at how uptight they are, right? Like they don't even want to laugh, right? And it's like, we're the ones who want to make space for subversive culture because we want to allow for these things. It's like the lefties who are trying to shut all these things down. So that's kind of fits in with this narrative that conservatives have lately been trying to develop, that let's like, we're the place for the counterculture. We're willing to laugh. It's like the others are all stiff and serious, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, just to draw it back, the left struggles because I think, I think I draw particularly here from the work of sort of Todd McGowan and his sort of work on universality and its relation to the particular and the singular universal. And for me, the left just struggles on fighting that terrain when it becomes about I can be the subversive one. I mean, that was this is what you get when we have it a lot in the UK. I think it was announced this week on Monday that John Cleese will be doing a documentary on Channel 4, a public service broadcaster in the UK, on cancel culture and woke culture. And I think he's someone who, the craziness of that. I mean, this was Monty Python fella who was, their comedy was all about the formal subversion of figures of authority, and what, the Catholic Church and everything. And now they just sort of become these angry old men who are just upset. Well, they're upset, aren't they, about being cancelled, and they're not having the right or the freedom to speak while hosting your own documentary,
right?
On a public. And that was the point I tried to make about Konstantin Kissin in the book. Is that this was a man who was whinging that he couldn't do his set due to this behavioural agreement, but then managed to get on all like the morning TV shows and managed to write in the Daily Mail, frighteningly the most read newspaper in the UK, was able to then use it as the linchpin for his subsequent tour. So I think it sells. I think if you go down that line of
totally. I'm curious if, and I think kind of Matt earlier we were talking about like defining political correctness, and I was curious if you like how you distinguish it, because I think there's like maybe a commonsensical definition that like non-academics will think about political correctness vaguely, at least. I think if you question them, they probably won't be able to give a coherent, because it is one of those strange categories. But then there's this category wokeness, and it's like, I don't know.
When you talk about non-academics, that's kind of exclusionary. Okay, I think we should be way wary of using that kind of language.
But I guess I'm curious, like, how do you see that? Like, do you kind of have a distinction or a line, or do you kind of think that they're words for the same phenomenon? I don't know. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's good. I think this is what we're sort of getting at. I think it's a brilliant question to start with, because I talk about the various definitions of political correctness in the book, and I didn't want it to be a book about essentially just nothing but political correctness. But in the opening chapters, I do look at sort of briefly where the term came from and how it has this sort of ideological sort of pertinence to it, where it can be used by both the left and the right. But what I sort of came to towards the end of the book was, perhaps the fact that it can be used in all these various different ways and it might not have a clear definition is something that can make political correctness comically subversive. So is it a term that in its own ridiculousness could be pushed and performed in such a way that it ends up being ridiculous and daft in that respect? And I think that's something I looked more towards the end of the book, this idea that, not to be against political correctness in such a way that political correctness is rubbish. Don't follow. It's mad, because then you end up on Jordan Peterson's side. But in a way where you could perhaps is there jokes? Are there comedy sequences? Are there scenes that we could perhaps use where political correctness gets played out to the point where its own inconsistencies are laid bare? And that might be something that is comical. It's something that perhaps comedians such as Monty Python did particularly well in the past, and in other forms as well. So I think if it's anything, I talk about at the end, I say, in theory, yes, but in practice, no. Yeah, in theory, it works, but in practice, no, let's never have political correctness, because let's constantly let it fail in that regard.
Actually, that's a fantastic segue to one of the big questions that I had for you, which is you had a really great analysis of what constitutes conservative comedy and what constitutes, I suppose you could call it radical or left comedy. And you described this using kind of a Hegelian language, where you just say that conservative comedy always tries to reaffirm the connection between the universal and the particular. If you think about somebody like the king, right? And every now and then it kind of mocks that or subverts it a little bit, but it's always affirmed at the end, right? Whereas radical comedy or left-wing comedy tries to detach very fundamentally the universal from the particular, right? So the kind of joke at the end of, say, a kind of diatribe against the king is that the king still thinks he's a king at the end of it, right? Whereas conservative comedy would say, the king is just a normal man like you, but he's still in charge, right? So can you talk a little bit about that and maybe give an example of somebody who was a talented left-wing comedian, right? Somebody who was able to engage in this probably unconsciously Hegelian project of deconstructing authority. And
actually, just quickly, I'm curious, is that also where the true comedy versus false comedy comes in? Is that the language? Yeah.
Yeah. So this is Alenka Žižek's definition there of distinguishing between what is true comedy and what is false comedy. So the key bit to remember there is the sense that in false comedy, she argues, and as I explore a bit further in the book, is conservative comedy. What it does is it keeps the universal and the particular apart. Okay, so she uses the example of the baron, the toffee-nosed baron, who slips in the puddle, slips on the banana peel, and he falls into the puddle of water, and we all laugh at him because he's a baron, but he's just like us. He's human type thing. So but he gets up and he continues to be the baron. So it's that, I think that's what you were getting at, Matthew, with regards. And for me, examples of that, one of the examples I draw upon in the book is, and this was interesting because again, I was using upon, the same writers and the same comedian, that to me would just underpin Ricky Gervais's Extras, where essentially what he was doing was he was getting notable celebrities to come onto the show and perform exaggerated versions of themselves. But you're meant to you're not laughing at celebrity, or you're not laughing at someone, say Chris Martin, obviously the lead singer of Coldplay. You're laughing at the performance of Chris Martin playing Chris Martin. So you get this separation there between the two, which my
favorite one is Patrick Stewart, I should say.
Yes, yeah. Patrick Stewart being a good example there. So they play like these sort of crazy versions of themselves, and then they can carry on. It's like I say in the book, Chris Martin can literally leave the studio after filming his extra scene and carry on being Chris Martin. But what's particular, I think what's phenomenal, what's brilliant in Zupančič's argument is she said true comedy is when, or the way I interpreted it and the way I read it was, true comedy is when the universal is shown to be inconsistent through a particular concrete example. So it's not the fact that the baron slips in the puddle and he's just like every other human on the planet. It's the fact that he gets up and still believes himself to be a baron, which is the comedy. So we're laughing at his presumptuousness in that regard. We're laughing at the title of baron. So there's this and she uses Hegel's concrete universal just to draw that out. And it's something I do in the book. But I think that's really interesting because to me, what that started to get me thinking along the lines of this idea of, can comedy be subversive? In what ways can universals be concretized in such a way where their own ridiculousness is laid bare? And I suppose, there's plenty of political examples. We've got Boris Johnson in the UK. I think, one of the things that always got me a little bit about, criticisms of Donald Trump was that it was always Donald Trump besmirching the office. This man's the leader of the free world. He's the president of the United States. And I was like, well, no, does this not show the ridiculousness of the president of the presidency now in contemporary, United States? The sense that, it's the system we ended up with him through the system. It might be the system that's broken if you end up with someone like Donald Trump at the end of it. So rather than so it kept it separate. It kept the title president and Donald Trump separate, rather than show actually what Donald Trump did was play out the ridiculousness of presidency in its title. And I think there's some good examples. I think Sacha Baron Cohen, I think, is quite good at times at playing out. Yeah, those, I think Borat in particular. I think there's versions of Baron Cohen. I thought his most recent Borat film was really good, to be honest with you. In playing, in performing that ridiculousness, he seems to take things to their logical conclusion where you're left laughing because you see how ridiculous something is. I think we have a comedian in the UK called Stuart Lee, who I could have completely and utterly written the book about Stuart Lee and his formal comedy. There was a phenomenal paper, which I cite in the book, which had already essentially done that. So I left it out. But what Stuart Lee's very good at, and you can see his clips on YouTube and whatnot, is that his comedy is in explaining the joke. So explaining what, it's weird. The joke is itself his explanation of the joke and why you find it funny. So you end up through this sort of puzzle where at the end you're laughing at something for its ridiculousnness. So I think he's a great example of somebody who perhaps performs this true comedy, this concrete universal. I draw upon, I provide my own Baron example in the book with a reference to a famous scene from, perhaps the most popular comedy in the UK would be Only Fools and Horses, where, I talk about that in the book a bit more. But
yeah, I mean, a lot of the kind of points that you make about comedy reminded me of a comment Lacan made, which itself was kind of a joke, where he said, if a man who thinks he is king is insane, then the king who thinks he is a king is no less so, right? This kind of idea that fantasias of power, right? And needing to recognize the contingency of all of them. But I think what you said about Donald Trump is something that I really agree with, right? I remember back, I think it was in 2018, when he brought McDonald's into the White House. And all kinds of so-called radical and liberal commentators were saying things like, this is ridiculous. He's undermining the dignity of the office. He's transforming the presidency into this kind of clownish enterprise. And what I want to say is like, no, I mean, in some senses, the most radical thing we could do is precisely to say there is no dignity to this office, right? He's operating as an imperial hegemon over the globe. And what we want to be doing is consistently subverting this. But I don't think that's what Trump was doing by bringing in things like McDonald's. I think he was playing out to exactly the kind of demographic you were talking about by saying, look, I'm just like you, but I'm also the president, right? So now you can fantasize about what it'd be like to wield the kind of power and have the kind of authority I do and project those kinds of impulses into me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a thin line. I mean, there is literally a picture, isn't there, of him stood in front of all the McDonald's Big Macs.
McDonald's I've ever seen, yeah.
Yeah, and you've got that. It reminds me of the film Richie Rich, because he has a McDonald's, doesn't he? And it's like, I'm, being young, I think, oh, I'd love to have a McDonald's in my hat. But so there is a comedy to it, and I think it's a thin line because, like you said, I think that has that popular appeal that sort of, look, man of the people, getting in McDonald's, getting, the great American fast food restaurant, getting them in to save the day type thing. But I think the interesting bit there is as I said, this thin line is between finding that funny, but then as you said there, or finding the whole performance itself ridiculous to the point where he's actually playing out that ridiculousness. I think that's something. I mean, I think that's essentially. I mean, it got him nothing but grief, did it? But I think that was kind of, that was Žižek's point, isn't it? When he did that, when he made that comment, didn't he, about why he'd vote for Trump? Because essentially, what does Trump do if not bring to bear the ridiculousness of liberal? He's a product of that system in that sense. Yeah,
this is actually, this is reminding me, and maybe I'm going to take the opportunity to. I've often made this argument a couple times, maybe on the podcast when we talk about. Actually, like the monarchy in Canada, because we're Canadians, and there's a lot of people are like, why bother with the monarchy? And I sometimes make this kind of argument that and what Matt was saying before reminded me that I sometimes argue that maybe there's some kind of helpful effect that having the monarchy, because somehow I think having this symbolic figure, and I wonder if it's similar in the UK, that kind of takes or somehow pulls away the mystique from the office of the prime minister, because it's all isolated in this symbolic figurehead. And it's I'm glad we have this, the figurehead who is supposedly the head of state doesn't actually have any power, but then the prime minister is just a commoner in the House of Commons. And I feel in the States, they're in this weird dilemma where because they don't have a symbolic figurehead, they end up investing the person who actually has the power with all this fantasy that I feel somehow need not be there. It's no, it would be ridiculous in Canada, I'm guessing in the UK, to be respect the office of the prime minister. It's who cares? It's it's not really a thing. And I think that's why I'm sometimes argue with other Canadians. It's good to keep the monarchy. It's it's useful.
That's how I always interpreted Hegel's concept of the monarch, in the fact that it shows, I think it plays out the paradoxes of the state. It becomes, as you quite rightly said, this symbolic figure embodies the inconsistency, so to speak. It's interesting because I'm a Republican. I don't want monarchy or anything, but this is I think what you're getting at, Victor. You end up in this awkward situation where actually I love at the minute Harry and Meghan Markle, purely for the fact that they are just showing up the royal family and the ridiculousness of that family and the cruelty of that family and all the nonsense, with Prince Andrew and everything going on at the same time. It's almost like...
Did you ever see the Get Out poster, the meme for that?
No.
Oh, the movie with the Peele, Jordan Peele's movie, Get Out?
Yeah, Get Out.
So they replaced all the characters in that. So it's Meghan Markle, who's the person who's running away from the family, and then it's just all the white royal family staring at her ominously. That's
brilliant. Right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's not brilliant for poor Meghan, but that's interesting. Yeah. I mean that's you end up in this awful conundrum where I'm a bit I suddenly now become pro monarchy with Meghan and Harry purely on the basis that they get to just show up the royal family. It's an odd one. Who knows? They hold on by their fingernails, the royal family, purely for the Queen. I think when she dies, I mean, one's down, isn't he? The husband's gone. So, I don't know. I think when she goes, I think there'll be big changes.
It's probably true. It's probably true. But it's just, I hate the way, in America, though, I just don't like how there's all this symbolic investment. It's the person who actually has the power. He has this, almost royal, the office of the president has this, royal feature to it that, is in people's psyche. And I feel that's actually, maybe bad somehow to,
Well, I mean, it's a brilliant example because we often, like, when people talk about republic, if you made the argument for republicanism in the UK, people go, "Oh, what do you want then? A president like the US?" Like, as if that's immediately
right, that's
worse. Considered worse. And people go, because then we'd end up with Tony Blair as president or something or other, or you know what I mean, or it'd end up like, I don't know, some public figure like Stephen Fry or something or other. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know, but they're not great examles. So you sort of end up going, well, actually, no, we don't want that type thing. So perhaps having an old woman.
Just a clownish family at the top who has no real power. Just let them absorb the whatever I don't exactly know how to like the term to use, but like the kind of symbolic investment away from the person who actually has the power.
Yeah, or embody the ridiculousness of having a nation state headed by, I think, you know, perhaps there's a safety valve there or something or other. The silliness of it, and it's awful because that comes with obviously all the awfulness of a monarchy and the history they embody. But perhaps there's spaces that can be opened up. I don't know. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay. So I wanted to ask too, like the sort of critique of political correctness. I mean, so I think at one point in the book, it's described as like, you know, it's like a safeguarding approach, and you say it functions to undermine any real capital R relationship. And I wonder if you could talk about like what you mean by capital R real relationships, and sort of like how you see political correctness as interfering with that ability. And I think it relates to something, you know, we were talking about earlier with like real comedy as revealing something. And I guess like somehow maybe it seems like you're arguing that political correctness prevents that possibility, I suppose, or it risks preventing that possibility.
It's a bit like, you know, like you might have pet name, you know, the people that you know, the people that know you best or the closest will have certain pet names for you that, you know, if your partner was to use, that's okay. And it might refer to, I don't know, and particularly idiosyncrasy about yourself, something you might have done in the past. But if, for instance, a stranger was to come up to say to it, you'd be a bit like, oh, God, you know, you're getting a bit too close, that sort of thing. So I think what I was getting at there with this sort of real contact is often I believe that it can be through telling a dirty joke or through comedy that might, on the face of it, seem quite illicit or wrong to even say, that actually you make the truest connection with individuals, and particularly with, you know, different, you know, perhaps people from different cultural backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds as well. And I think that's what I was getting at there with that sort of real that sort of real contact. It's that idea. I always like that quote. It was I think that Žižek used about from George Orwell. He says that, you know, if I want to make, you know, I can't just pat a proletarian on the back and say, yeah, come on, let's have the socialist revolution. I've actually probably got to engage in a process and with someone that's going to take a lot of work, if you know what I mean. And I think that's what I was getting at there with this sort of real contact. It's where does it lie? It's where do those boundaries lie, sort of thing. And I think this is really interesting because you asked me at the start, where did some of these ideas come from for the book? And I can only ever come back to one example, which was with a colleague I worked. So when I started at my institution, I mean, this is in itself an example which I think brings everything together, which we've been talking about here. But when I started at my university, I had, to that point in my life as well. So when I started there, I think it was 24, 25, I'd had one black manager. And what was interesting was obviously I'd had this week of starting at my institution. You're introduced to numerous managers. You can't remember any of their names by the end of it. And a lot of the managers, very white, middle class, would say to me, have you met this particular manager? And I'd be like, which one is that? And they'd be, black fella. And it would always be whispered. They'd touch their face and it'd be whispered. And then a couple of months later, we'd gone out for a drink after work and he was in the pub. And I remember, it must have been because I'd had a drink. I don't know. But I told him this joke. I said to him, you know, it was hilarious. And because what I ended up doing was I deliberately started to say I couldn't remember who this person was, just so I could make a lot of these people feel uncomfortable by saying he's the black fella. So I told him this joke and he turned round to me, and I was nervous when I said it, but he turned around to me and said, what I usually say to that, Jack, is if you think I'm black, wait till you see my arsehole. And it was filth. You know, we've probably been, you know, imagine if we'd said that in a departmental meeting, you know, there'd have been uproar, but we got on famously after that, you know, and there was something about, I don't know, it was trying to articulate that in in the book, I think, which was key. And again, I think Žižek's work was the only thing that allowed me to sort of explore that. I think it's that real contact. It's the dirty jokes you share with people that are where real connection lies.
And that reminds me, I think in your book too, you talk about, and this is something, I mean, all of us actually on the podcast are fans of Žižek, and I think share this kind of view of like that he's offering something important that no other academics talk about. But like one of the things I think is this idea that I guess like all social interaction involves some kind of risk of putting yourself out there, and it seems like you were saying that political correctness in some ways is an effort to try to like eliminate this risk, which ends up kind of being self-defeating. And it's like I think that maybe the purpose, or that you're trying to get at, is like we have to reckon with that there's always going to be some sort of risk involved in our social interactions. And it's like, I guess this kind of subversive comedy can bring that to the light in like a constructive, intersubjectively connective way where we can connect better with each other. And it also reminds me, and I think you bring it up in the book too, like the classic Žižek shtick that he has about like seduction, right? It's like that it's like it always involves a transgression, or the possibility of transgression, that then gets retroactively described as either like a harassment or successful seduction. And not that, you know, we want to reduce seduction to being like pure transgression, but it just is the fact that there's always a risk that it's going to be taken up in this way. And I think similarly, like your joke to your colleague could have been taken up, and you just kind of had to take the leap and see what happened.
Definitely, and I think, yeah, I mean, it's that idea that you make a pass, and you're either going to be seen as a creep for making the pass, or it's going to be reciprocated, and retroactively everything was good and everything was fine. But and I think there was a formal significance there in our day-to-day interactions, that sort of, and you know, moving away from that sort of risk being regulated towards telling a joke. Like, you know what I mean? You tell, you know, I undenied whether or not I should use that example there of the colleague at work. You know, when we tell a joke, and I think it was really interesting. There was there's a book on Žižek and performance where the author in there is a stand-up comedian, and he says, like, you stand up in front of this room. You've got all the lights on you. You often can't see the crowd. So you're talking into like an abyss, and you're taking this leap of faith when you tell a joke, because that joke might not be funny, or people in the room might not get it. And I think there's a formal link there between comedy, the actual telling of a joke, and the risk involved in taking a joke, something that can be played with and hopefully made fun of, but also the risk there that's involved in every interaction we have.
Well, I want to actually broaden the discussion a little bit, because this is something I've always wanted to ask an expert. So conveniently enough, here you are, and I can ask it. So going back to like elementary school, which is how far back we have to go. I remember one of my English teachers said, well, the difference between comedy and tragedy is that tragedy, bad things happen at the end. You know, you think of Hamlet, everyone's dead. Comedy, it ends up, you know, everyone's fine. That doesn't really seem like a very satisfying definition to me, though. And one of the things that occurred to me is that tragedy has been very theorized on, and there are a million different definitions of it, you know, from, well, tragedy reflects on life suffering, to tragedy is about the despair that one feels about having to be oneself when one wants to be another person. Millions of definitions. But it's really hard for me to think of a good definition of comedy, in part because it's really hard for me to even think about what makes something funny, right? You just kind of instinctively know what's funny. And I'm sure there are a lot of different reasons for that. So can you tell us, what is comedy exactly? And why do you think people laugh? What do they find funny, or what makes something funny?
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. I think to me, again, and I think this is, you know, I'm drawing upon, I think what I'm about to say, Zupančič sits behind it. It's when something's shown to be inconsistent. It's when something is taken to a logical conclusion where you don't end up with anything new. You don't end up with anything gained, apart from the fact that what you thought you were going to see has been reversed or returned to, or you might have just received the same thing. And that's probably not too clear in the way I'm necessarily explaining that. But I think it's not necessarily incongruity. I talk about incongruity in the book, and I think that's quite a common, particularly within the study of comedy, that comedy is this incongruity, that it's when something is it's like where something is where it shouldn't be type thing. Todd McGowan in his book talks about it being the sort of meeting, the dialectical meeting of a lack with an excess. And he has sort of plenty of examples there. So he talks, quite brilliantly about Hannibal Lecter. You can actually find Hannibal Lecter quite funny because his jokes are excessively based on death. So it's the lack, and death. So it's the meeting of those two. But for me, it's when something that you might take for common sense or taken for granted is shown to be played out and be inconsistent. So comedy's a bit like, have you ever, like, it's a bit like, when you're walking along a path and like you meet and you go right and they go right and then you go left and they go left and you end up in this weird sort of tension with some. I mean, to me, that would be the naturalness that you get there. Because all you can do there is look at the other person and laugh, can't you? You know what I mean? Because you're stuck in this ridiculous situation. And I think it's when something's made concrete. I mean, again, that's where I come back to this use of Hegel's concrete universal. I think that's what good comedy does, I think, often.
Well, why do we find different things funny, though? And this is something that's always perplexed me. So, back in the day when I was 5 years old, I watched Bugs Bunny cartoons where most of the shit is about slapstick. And Žižek talks about, things like, the coyote runs out across a cliff. And it really reflects what you're talking about, right? There's this inconsistency because he seems to be able to transcend gravity until he realizes what he's doing, after which he falls. And that's funny. But then you go on to the other end of the spectrum and you could think of things like very highbrow comedy, right? Think about something like, I don't know, Ricky Gervais, commenting on socio-political issues. Or like you said, Louis C.K. ruminating on existentialism and death and nihilism in our culture and stuff. Very, very different kind of end of the spectrum. So why is it that the coyote falling down the cliff and breaking his nose or whatever is funny? And these ruminations about death at a very high level of sophistication are also amusing. What connects these two things beyond just the fact that there's an inconsistency in our expectations and what occurs?
That's a wonderful question. That I would have to explore that in another book, because I think that's a great... to go from the sort of, the literal, the comic there from the Hanna-Barbera sort of, I'm thinking as well, I'm trying to think, there's a connection there because they're both funny, but I think I would come back to the formal way in which they're being played out. To me, slapstick can be funny, but I often wonder if slapstick follows a path of sort of irony or that sort of cynical resignation. I don't know if that's something I would see the two. You know what I mean? You can laugh at the coyote because, I don't know, it's not you falling, if that makes sense. But perhaps the difference there is sort of, something that Louis C.K. might have done is you probably lived it a little bit, if you know what I mean. Which is why, as a child, you wouldn't find it funny. I'm trying to think of like typical sort of Louis C.K. jokes here. It's interesting because, I remember when I was younger and Ricky Gervais, to use him as an example, I didn't find his stand-ups that funny. But I think the older I've got, I've seen clips of them and I've found them funny. And I remember watching them when I was younger and they weren't funny. So I suppose perhaps there's something there about experience, or at least that way in which you might have experienced that particular inconsistency or impasse. I don't know. That's a phenomenal question because, like you said, it draws upon so much. It's like animation, I think, is quite good at performing that sort of, perhaps that early. I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the reason I thought the first time this occurred to me was actually during my undergrad because I was reading some Socratic dialogue, might have been like the Euthyphro or whatever. And, I kind of having a hoity-toity laugh at how he was just like owning all these people. Like, that's kind of clever, right? Then I went out and had a couple beers with some friends of mine, and we ended up watching, I think it was like Trailer Park Boys. And it was just this long like joke about people getting really fucked up on like booze and weed and stuff. And I thought it was hilarious. And I kind of was thinking to myself, like, I don't understand what makes, this platonic dialogue funny. And then seeing Mr. Leahy and the Trailer Park Boys get like really fucked up and like stumble down the stairs is also funny. There's something that connects these two things, but I'm just not sure what it is. So I don't know. Go on. Sorry.
It's a complicated question. Yeah, Trailer Park Boys is a Canadian show. I'm not sure if you guys got it in the UK or not, but
yeah, we get it on Netflix and what? Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Oh, do you? Okay. Yeah.
So I've seen that. Yeah, I've seen the clips of it and whatnot.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, I wasn't sure.
Trying to think of a sort of a UK equivalent, but yeah. Is it mockumentary style? If I'm right.
Yes. It is.
Right. Okay. Yeah. We have something called This Country. Might be a bit similar, but I question those because, as I said, I do wonder if sometimes. It's something I talk about in the book between this idea of the distance. This idea perhaps we are finding those examples funny because cynicism, irony, satire are all funny. They make you laugh, but I wouldn't call them subversive. I think that's why I would perhaps we're coming up with some sort of typology here where we would find something else funnier than say those examples. But I think for me, what they're very good at is they create that distance between you and what you're seeing. You can laugh at the silly trailer park person because they're being daft and stupid, ha ha ha. And I think that's perhaps interesting. That's a dynamic to it, that we get this distance towards it. We have, I think, someone who plays with that quite nicely is Charlie Brooker. So I'm always curious to know this. Like, I suppose you know it through Black Mirror. I think it's been quite a worldwide.
I also lived in Ireland for a year, and the girl I was dating was British. So we ended up watching a lot of those Ricky Gervais shows.
Oh, good. Right. Yeah. So, but Charlie Brooker had a career way before, like, obviously Black Mirror. I think he was a Guardian. He reviewed PlayStation games, I think, originally, but he had a show called Newswipe, and it was essentially where he took the mick out of the news. But what he did quite well in that was he would perform the audience as part of the show. So he would have these sort of little skits where it would cut to him sat on the sofa watching the news, and he would perform. He would take it literally, what the news was saying. And I think that was really interesting because he played there, I think, with our own position, where I'm talking there about having the distance to the coyote, the coyote on screen falls off the mountain, so to speak, and we find that funny. He played with that. So I think he performed us as audiences watching comedy. And, there's clips of it on YouTube, no doubt. But perhaps there's something there in it as well, I think. Yeah.
So I've got like a couple more questions, but I think Matt needs to go. So we'll let him go, and then Jack, if you don't mind, we can just finish up. I'll do a couple more.
No, yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for your questions, Matt. That was it's just lovely to speak about stuff. So yeah, thank you for that and taking the time.
Yeah, man. And best of luck with your next project. Okay. And thanks a lot for coming on.
No worries.
Cool. Peace.
All right. So I was wondering about, you say. And I think, I come from a political theory perspective. So did Matt. And I think that, like, when I read books, I'm often, as a political theorist, like looking for a kind of like normative recommendations, maybe not quite the right word, but I guess I was detecting sort of like or at least a bit of a normative claim about like the value of comedy or might be, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, it's like that maybe it can help people realize, I think I saw the language of a consciousness of contingency. If you recall that. And I was wondering if you could talk about what role that plays and what you mean by consciousness of contingency, or maybe you might have been quoting someone at the time.
Yeah.
But
so I think, this idea of, I've always read sort of, and again, drawing upon here, Žižek sort of Hegelianism, particularly in the relationship between contingency and necessity. But I think one of the things that what contingency brings to light is it shows that relationship that every identity has with its non-identity, so its own self. Again, to come back to this, this inconsistency, the gap in being, so to speak, the sort of the dialectical materialism that Žižek draws upon. So for me, when I was talking about contingency, is when something realizes something about itself that it hadn't previously seen or hadn't necessarily been aware of, if that makes sense. So it's so philosophically, it's the idea that the sort of the glass I'm drinking from is not a mug or a wine glass, and yet those things that it ain't, or those things that it's not, can form part of what it is, type thing. So I think that's what I was getting at there, and I just think that's something that comedy is really good at, showing the ridiculousness not just of our symbolic, mandate, the things we use in everyday social interactions, not only showing them to be inconsistent and perhaps a little ridiculous, but also ourselves as well. And I think that's something played out in the example that I use in the book as well from The Office, is that it's that realization that perhaps you've been a bit daft in following that logic or in that respect. So, and I think that those have a certain sort of those moments perhaps have a contingency to them. I mean, I think that's really interesting, isn't it? The idea about, one thing I've always found interesting with stand-up comedians is like they will perform something for 18 months. Like, I suppose the contingency there comes from the audiences that you're doing it for, isn't it? But like, I suppose sometimes like real comedy, so it happens out of the blue, all of a sudden you've realized. And I think it's that sort of conscious recognition. It's really interesting because I read that along the lines of, Lacan's traversal of the fantasy, realizing, that the ego ideal that you've been subscribed, is a bit daft and a bit nonsense, because that, and that's where I suppose that's where I linked it with the subversive aspect in that regard.
So it's interesting because when I was reading it, I sort of saw some parallel maybe between some of the stuff I've been working on in my dissertation right now, which I'm reading the Radical Democratic Theorists, and I think you cite Laclau and Mouffe at one point in the book, and the other people like Rancière and Butler and these other people. And I think that one of the things I've noticed is that when they talk about sort of like agonistic relations with our fellow citizens, they often have it premised on this idea that people need to have some awareness of like the contingency of their beliefs, and they can be very like spirited in fighting for their political perspective in agonistic relations, but they need to understand the contingency of their own beliefs versus the others, so that way, like, these relations don't devolve into antagonism, so they remain kind of agonistic or whatever. And I sort of saw a little bit of a parallel where, like, at least insofar as it seemed like what you were saying is like comedy kind of can help us reveal to us the sort of contingency and like the bullshit of like these self-identities. But I guess like the trouble that I have with the Radical Democrats, and maybe the trouble that I also have with, is like, are regular people, and in the case of radical democracy, regular citizens, like, are they really understanding that? Right? Like, or is it just us theorists who are kind of like drawing on with our theoretical apparatus? And that's the trouble I have with the Radical Democrats. It's like, I actually think that like having that realization and that insight is actually quite hard. It actually requires education to understand, the contingency, discursive contingency and all these things. And it's like, and I wonder whether like, comedy, they realize something, right? Because they laugh. And I was thinking earlier, based on the conversation we were having about like what explains comedy, and it's like, it could be that maybe this background of like the contingency is like actually part of what makes people laugh. But I don't know. But do you think that it's actually that like they're actually realizing that? And if they're not, I guess maybe the like more PC person would retort and be like, well, they're not even going to understand. It's not going to be subversive because they're not going to understand these insights. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful interpretation. It's like you said, I think that's what I was getting, with the thin line here. And if you're going to tell a racist joke, what happens when it's just racism, or what if when it's just perceived as racism? Which it can be. And obviously, there are racist jokes, obviously. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think it points, and you're right to sort of point there to a more fundamental issue, in the sense of how do you put that into some form of program or process? Because it's a bit like you said, you mentioned there Rancière and Žižek's very common, will very typically draw upon, he's the part of no part when he talks there. And it's something, Todd McGowan talks about with regards to the singular universal. But if it's outside, like as soon as it becomes inside, you know what I mean? Or if it redefines something new, when does it just end up becoming what we had before type of thing? And I think that to me would be a wonderful explanation of the sort of the fundamentalness or the sort of the fundamentality of contradiction. And that perhaps that's why I like the concrete universal, this sense that perhaps all you can do is at least make efforts to show the ridiculousness of something. It comes out, I think, brilliantly through something that I'm looking at the minute in relation to nationalism and sport, that actually, one thing everybody's very proud of. Nationalism is what, pride in your country, feeling an attachment to this collective. But perhaps the truest form of nationalism is to actually find your country utterly ridiculous in all senses of the term, and that it screws things up, it gets things wrong. It's something that, it's sort of how I have to approach the English national football team, in that, yes, we'll get to the final, but we're probably going to lose that final because this is England and football. It's the only way I can stomach that. But again, I think, like you say, I think that's what you're getting at there, is how you turn that into some form of political program. I mean, it's a political, it's a politics there of the negative. It's a politics of something that perhaps redefines the symbolic order, I suppose.
Yeah, and I wonder whether or not it's also just like the point about like that, like maybe comedy is also just useful for what we were talking about before, as just getting people more comfortable with the fact that there's always going to be risk involved in our social interactions, and like that we have to be willing to take the leap, otherwise we're not going to connect with each other or something like that. Like that seems like the part that, rather than consciousness. Well, I mean, maybe that is a form of consciousness of contingency, right? Because it's like the risk. It's like, I don't know. Maybe that's wrong, but
I think you're on the right. It's in some sense, and it was something I was thinking about earlier, and it's a theme I think, particularly in psychoanalytic, philosophical critical theory interpretations. I think this is something that seems to be at the forefront of that school of thought at the minute. This idea of avowing your enjoyment in something and then finding limitations to collective forms of limitation on that enjoyment, I think is the connection that needs to be made theoretically and practically and politically in that sense. It was, it's that idea, I think, sometimes the hardest thing to do with a racist is to get them to admit that they enjoy their racism. And, and you see that actually in people that sort of, always say, I'm not a racist, but ... I find this or whatnot. And I think if you can avow, if you bring to light the enjoyment at play, the undercurrent there of enjoyment that comes out through comedy, perhaps, then you can find ways around it or collective forms of limiting that in some sense. Because like you said, are we just theorizing in the school of
It's always a risk, I think, when we get into high theory that I think that's something we all deal with as theorists.
The beauty of the risk, though, practically may be that retroactively it will never be a risk because it will redefine. I think that's what Badiou gets at with the event. I think that's what Žižek's getting at there with his interpretation of the act. That a true act, it's there what he means in the past. You know what I mean? When you make that pass, when the woman asks the man for his number or vice versa, it becomes the start of the relationship when they're married so many years later. You know what I mean? It was the ultimate that redefined the logic. If it goes wrong, then one of you's a creep for asking me for the number. Yeah, I suppose that's interesting. I mean, that's really interesting if we think of, COVID. I don't know at the minute, the complete utter failure to politically do something with COVID. I think, I don't know if that connection there or whatnot. Or
earlier, I was kind of curious about, and we sort of touched on it a little bit, but I think it's interesting for you to take on this topic in a book, and I think that we alluded to the sort of the difficulty, and it seems like we're all probably on some version of the left wing, and I think it's like, have you gotten any like reactions for like tackling this topic from people, and like how do you sort of navigate, because I think it's really easy to look like a reactionary when you're tackling this, and I wonder, how have you navigated that, and has it been anything when people see, oh, you wrote a book on this, and it's like people maybe make assumptions, and I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, it's awful. I did a book launch for the book. I had a book launch, and at the start of the book launch, I showed the scene, the clip from The Office where the black man's cock joke is told, and the next day, the person who chaired the book launch came back and said, "We've had a complaint. Somebody's complained."
Oh God!
About how that could have made someone, a black person, feel uncomfortable, and it was kind of like you've really missed the heart of what the purpose there. It was a clip. Obviously, there was an analysis that went with it. It wasn't just that type thing. And that's, to be honest with you, that's the only. It was interesting. It came from the actual book launch. I presented the sort of the heart of the book on 3 other occasions, and I'd shown that scene, the scenes as well, and had never necessarily got a bad response from it, if that makes sense. I think it was this. Yeah. So it's. I suppose that's the only. That's the only openly negative thing I've had. It was something I really, I was very conscious of when writing the book. I just could never. I think that when the episode aired, which was it was either 2001 or 2002. I just never forgot that joke and the way it was played out. And it was something I really wanted dedicated sort of a close analysis to, because it seemed, it got ignored a lot in debates on sort of race and political correctness and the use of comedy and approaching those. I think I didn't want to lose comedy because I wanted to use comedy to subversively challenge, obviously, racist beliefs and assumptions. And I think it was something I didn't want to put in scare quotes or stand back, you know what I mean? Or just, it's when things get told no. It's when that to me is the issue. When we're banning that, no, that's not happening. And it's like, well, okay, well, then we've lost the debate there. I don't know.
It's tough to be in this situation because I think the temptation to absolutize is just so great on both sides that I feel like people with kind of our, to include me and Matt and you, and it's like people who are interested in, well, Žižek, I think, is one of the few, I think, who's kind of like trying to occupy this sort of space to like notice that there's these dynamics going on that actually like prevent or kind of like are self-defeating that we don't realize in our political projects. And, you know, earlier you were talking about enjoyment, and I'm reminded, I wonder, have you ever heard of this, there's this blues musician, this black blues musician who started befriending KKK members, and just because he was so curious about like why they hated him. He's this American guy, and then he started just talking to them about music, and then eventually over the years, never challenging them overtly on their beliefs, but just like talking to them. And then he ended up collecting like dozens of robes of KKK members who gave up the Klan because of just like engaging with him. And they made a documentary about him, and there's a striking moment where he's talking to Black Lives Matter members, and they're all furious with him, right? Because he's, and I think it kind of makes me think about how there's the enjoyment of the racist, but there's also kind of the enjoyment of the anti-racist, right? And it's like when somebody is actually, I felt like this guy Daryl Davis was sort of disrupting that enjoyment, because he was like, you can actually humanize these people who are racists and just talk to them, and maybe that'll work.
It's finding that shared absence. I think, you know, what is it that you both don't have, which is why one of you has turned to racism in the first place altogether. I think is interesting there. It's, you know, the KKK is a really interesting example. I remember a famous sort of social psychologist in the UK, Michael Billig. You know, he wrote a lot about comedy and racism, and he went on sort of KKK websites, and specifically looked at like jokes pages. They have jokes pages on KKK websites, and would analyze the jokes. But his analysis for me always ended up saying, and they're racist. Well, I felt like going, well, of course they're racist. You know, you've gone to a racist website to read racist jokes, and the content is racist. But, you know, there's a formalness to there. And I think it's something in the book I really wanted to move away was ignore, you know, get away from the content, the fact that a black blues, singer spoke to a KK member, and look at the form that might be taking place. The formal logic of the joke is where you might find subversion there. And it's something that I tried to explore a bit more. That's something I tried to look at in the book, is sort of the importance there of the form. And that to me is what made the Ricky Gervais scenes I analysed really interesting, because the form was constantly, the form was being played with and used, I think, in a particular way. For me, the position of enunciation, the person telling the joke moved in the process of telling the joke. So the content stayed the same. The content was racist. The joke's a racist joke, but the way in which the racist joke is told has a formal significance to it, which is something that that's essentially what Žižek's doing whenever he tells his risky jokes, isn't it? He's trying to draw attention to the formal logic at play in the joke he's telling. So get away from the racist content and look at what it exposes. What presumptions do you bring to the joke before you even heard the joke?
Maybe one other thing I'm curious about is just like in general, what led you to an interest in Lacanian psychoanalysis and Žižek? Like, was that just something you learned in undergrad? Like, how did that process lead you? Because it's a huge influence on your work. So
yeah, I was never in my undergrad was I taught Žižek or Lacan or psychoanalysis, and I think I'd always say to anybody, and perhaps it's the people we learn on the side, so to speak, that actually are the ones that we really enjoy listening to. I think for me it was I remember doing my PhD as well, and someone saying I must have gone on some sort of rant in the pub probably one night, and someone said to me, "Have you heard of this? Have you seen this fella online?" And I was like, "Oh no, who?" And it was then I remember, and it was Slavoj Žižek they were referring to. So they must have seen the connection there, I don't know, of some sort. But it was actually a colleague who I worked with at my university who introduced me to Žižek's work. So this would have been probably the back end of about 2015. Yeah, I read The Sublime Object of Ideology, and it was my brain was different after that. It was like sort of, I think he gave you the language to say what it is I wanted to say, but couldn't articulate in any user theory before. My background was predominantly sociology as well. So I think that was very sort of, you stay away from any sort of psychology or, psychoanalysis. The two aren't connected at all. But I think a boredom perhaps was social theory predominantly, which I think was just lacking.
Yeah. Fair enough. Do you know the comedian Patrice O'Neill? He was American. I think he died like maybe 5 years ago.
No. No.
There's a clip that I always liked of him where I think it's actually thinking about maybe just like showing you like the clip. I don't know if you'd be up for that. It's like
definitely. Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, let me see if I can. I mean, we may or may not use it in the final edit, but I just thought it could be interesting. Okay, let me see if now
is radio cleaning house after the Imus debacle. With me now, New City President Sonia Osorio. She took part in a recent protest calling for radio stations to stop supporting negative language in music and talk radio, and also our favorite stand-up comic, Patrice O'Neill.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Patrice, are O&A next?
I hope not. I wish JV and Elvis didn't lose their job or Imus. It's funny. This is the thing. I don't know her, but I'm assuming that she has nothing to do with funny. So I'm gonna speak as the expert on funny. Funny people should just be left to trying to be funny.
What if they're not funny?
Then you made a mistake. But how many times has unfunny rape jokes lead to rape? Like,
I don't know how many jokes about rape there are.
There's a lot, but your world is not funny. Your world is next on the big story. My world is people trying to be funny.
Well, I mean, you think it's okay to try to make jokes about rape?
I'm diabetic. I make fun of that. I'm a victim. I might lose a toe. But I'm trying to make fun of. I'm trying to make fun of anything I think I can make fun of.
Sonia?
You know, what's happening now is the marketplace is deciding what's appropriate or what's not appropriate. I think the nation is just tired. There's a new mood in the nation.
What nation?
The nation. You know what? We're tired of things that are just
the nation is paper and you? I'm not the nation. I'm just speaking for me and funny. You're speaking for the nation, or you're speaking for...
Yeah, you know why? Because I remember 6 years ago doing something against Anthony Openy because they were just so outrageous, and their violent images they put out to women was just uncalled for. And now I think people...
You think they were trying to be funny?
I think now people in this country
think they were trying to be funny?
Tired. You know what? I don't care if they're trying to be funny.
That's what I'm saying. Why are you in that business?
I've been to your show once, and it wasn't very funny being a woman.
It was hilarious.
When you talked about...
That's why she doesn't like me. I was in the paper with her, and the joke is hilarious, called The Angry Pirate. And the lady who wrote it in her outrage didn't even know what it meant. And anybody who read it laughed because they know what funny... You're not living in the context of funny. You're living in the context of fire.
Have every right to be as funny as they want. They can go out and try to be as funny as they want, make as much money being as funny as they want. This is what's happening. There is a change in this country. People are realizing they have an opportunity to speak out, and advertisers are listening. Radio stations are listening.
You're not talking to who I talk to.
And you're not going to get paid as much money anymore.
Sonia and Patrice,
that's
look
what
at
it
this.
is. The marketplace
More
is
CBS
speaking.
radio firings. They've been on a tear lately.
All right.
Are they cleaning house, or is this the PC cops run amok?
You know what it is, John. You know what it is while you're reading that paper. It's the PC cops run amok.
Do you think she's a PC cop?
Of course she is. She has an entire encyclopedia of her stance on it, but it's no passion involved. It's not a real... This is just what she has to say. We are outraged and fired and fired and fired. Name calling. I'm outraged. I am outraged.
You should be outraged.
I am a fool. Now, if I called you a fool,
You know what? People are feeling a new sense of entitlement.
Who are these people
in this country?
Who are the people?
A new sense of entitlement.
Here's my question. How can you justify a bad joke, a joke that isn't funny? Wait a minute.
Go ahead.
An attempt that isn't funny, doesn't get any laughs, and is about raping the first black woman to ever become the Secretary of State of the United States.
Throw that at me.
Well, why not?
The attempt is what I'm trying to fight for. The joke funny jokes and unfunny jokes are come out of the same birth. That you don't know if anything is going to be funny. You should attempt to be able to make anything funny.
Don't you think a joke about rape is doomed to be not funny?
It's possible, but I've heard them.
You've heard a funny rape joke?
I say a couple. Watch my HBO special. I'm pretty good at it.
Anyway, that's
a book in itself as well, isn't it? My God,
yeah.
What an example. No, I hadn't come across that example before, but that is interesting. There's a book written on rape jokes.
Is there?
So, hold on 2 seconds. I'm so annoyed. I've left my rape. I've got I've got it because I've always wanted to write a paper on it. But there was a performance artist, a woman who published a book just consistently of rape jokes, and Žižek writes the preface, the introduction, a sort of review of it at the start. And I've always wanted to try and extend some of the ideas in the book by looking at this. But she's a performance artist, and what she would do was the book, she would stand on stage at, say, I don't know if it was a comedy festival or if she booked out a theatre, and she would put the lights, all the lights would be on, or the lights would be shining on the audience, and she would just sit at the stage for and read 400 rape jokes.
Oh, wow.
And it's so interesting, the stuff that's been written around it, because obviously, some people laugh at them, some people nervously laugh, some people would get up and walk out. I'm gonna have to find.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And what I also find interesting about that clip is I thought of the clip when I was reading your book, specifically about sort of the idea of that there's always a risk in our social interactions, that it's you have to just take the leap, and how political correct, or the way at least it was defined partially, is trying to eliminate that risk, right? And I think that it seems like what he was trying to argue for there, right, is just he's argued the attempt that I like when he says that funny and unfunny jokes come from the same place, right? It's they're both, and it's you have to be allowed to try to take that risk, take that chance, or something like that.
Definitely. I mean, the joke. Sorry, you're right, and I think it's one thing. The way I tried to engage with that in the book was looking, and I think Alenka Zupančič mentions it a couple of times. I'm trying to think of other books. I don't think Todd McGowan ever refers to it. But for me, what I thought was really interesting was Lacan's position of enunciation, and then the subject of enunciation and the subject of enunciated. So the enunciated is the content of what is said, and then the subject of enunciation is the position from which it's said, as well. And I think this is really interesting, because I remember I'd never seen the example or heard of it, but I think I was listening to another podcast by some other people, and there was an example there of Zach Galifianakis, who'd gone up to Chris Rock, and had wanted to tell Zach Galifianakis wanted to tell Chris Rock the most racist joke he'd ever heard. I think to build that sort of weird. To build some form of connection with him. But I think what's really interesting there is that you've essentially got a white man telling a very racist joke to a black man who has no other, what can he do in that instance, Chris Rock, apart from, offense or find it funny / awkwardly have to find it funny, because what else can he do in that situation? And I think that's where the subject, the person from which the joke's being told, is really interesting. Because that can move, what I think that position plays with is what we've been referring to as the inconsistency, the gap in the joke itself. I mean, perhaps the issue there was I didn't obviously see the original fellas telling the joke, but perhaps what was getting lost there was it was focusing on the fact that it might have been, I don't know, I presume two white fellas telling a joke about two white fellas telling a joke about raping a black politician. But that's focusing on the content and not the position, which I think is interesting. Which is interesting. The example. Sorry, because that is a good. I'm gonna have to find that link. Sorry, and then they got the black comedian where the position changes. So I think what you're getting at there with the risk, he's trying to expose the inconsistency of the joke. What is this fetishization of the first black politician?
Right.
First of all, it's not. That's a shame. That shows. That's what I was trying to get at with the example I used at the colleague. The fact that I'd only had one black manager growing up in the UK up until that, is a problem, highlights the problem. The fact that people felt uncomfortable enough to even refer to skin color in everyday conversation is the problem, the gap that it exposed.
So I think maybe one last question I'll ask before I let you go is just, sort of, if a non-academic person were to ask you, so I saw the title of your book, so is it okay for me to use racist jokes? What would you say to sort of because obviously we've been talking, I mean, we've probably answered that question through our discussion, but I'm just I'm interested in how you explain that, your view based on your research, to a non-academic who just asks you, I saw the title, you're talking about this, should I not like political? Should I just say whatever I want? Like, obviously not, but I'm just curious. How do you?
So the book is not a call for more open racism, and the fact that I would reply to that person: the fact you're having to ask the question, "Can I tell racist jokes?" Therefore, proves to me no, you should never tell a racist. Don't even. You're not funny. Don't even go near it, because you've lost something there. You're perhaps, you know what I mean. It takes a certain amount of, it's the dexterity that is there in our social relationships. It's that, it's what that comedian there was saying about, the risk, the sort of the funny and the unfunny are there. Should you tell, I mean, I would always say that, if that person was asking that type of question, then, how many black people do you know? Or how many, Hispanic people do you know? Because clearly you're not, those jokes would come out to the point where it wouldn't even feel like jokes, would it? Perhaps that's the point that I'm trying to reach with the book, or that might be this, whatever the ideal that can never be reached, is to the point where it would just be funny, not opposed to being a racist joke, so to speak. Which I think,
for sure.
Yeah, which is good. But as I say in the book, the joke I analyze is a racist joke, but in what ways is the telling and the formal logic of that joke able to elicit something about the subversiveness of the way in which comedy can be subversive? And you end up with a different approach, I think, to the joke than when you first hear it through. It's played out. The joke's played out over 4 scenes, and I think by the end you're left appreciating the joke more though than what you would if, for instance, you were just to go onto the street and walk up to somebody.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, I think it's important, and I think to some extent, I mean, I feel like your book is also, it's in drawing attention to like the subversive potential in comedy. I think it's like an important contribution because, I think we've lost sight of that somewhat on the left sometimes. So I think like being able to point out like how that can function is important.
Yeah, well, that's exactly, the left wants its object. The left wants to say this is the path we take to achieving the utopia or achieving equality. And I think that's when it's playing the rights game. And I think actually you can never get to that object directly. It might take a little bit of joking and messing about, a bit of offense along the way.
Exactly. And I think that's ultimately like, maybe that's sort of what I read the point of the book too. It's like, you're not going to be able to settle things comfortably. Like there's just like this inherent ambiguity that we live in as a consequence of just like being human beings with each other. And we just have to like realize the risks that are involved in that. And like that if we want to make authentic connections and authentic solidarity, it's going to involve doing things that there's some level of discomfort, and to put it simply, right? It's like you're not ever going to be able to eliminate that discomfort.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. That antagonism, I think. Yeah, definitely.
Exactly.
Oh, that's good. Or at least, that's wonderful. And so thank you for that. At least I think I might have written it how I wanted it to be perceived then. So thanks for that.
Good. Yeah, good. Well, Jack, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and really appreciate your time in the book. And hopefully we'll keep in touch, and wish you all the best.
No, thank you. This has been the best discussion I've had on the book. So thank you ever so much for taking the time out to obviously look at it and read it and speak as well. So thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, no problem. It was an absolute pleasure. So.